Yeah, so how's it? So I want to give you some information about what to expect when you are putting in an offer, and this is for you as a buyer, and this is good information for a seller too. So, you know, when you purchase a house, you go and view, you purchase, you want to make an offer on the property. An offer to purchase has to be signed. Let's just simplify it. That it's the paperwork that is an agreement between you, the buyer, and the seller as to the conditions of the offer. And once that offer is signed by both parties, it's then handed over to transfer attorneys, and that is a binding document once it's signed, and that the transfer attorneys will work off the information, and the bond or the bank, the bond issuer, will work off the information put on the offer. So there's a couple of things that you should know about when you're signing an offer. So, you know, the offer must have your names on it, your address, an email address where people can correspond with you, and your home address as well. It then must have the purchase amount, the amount that you're putting in the offer for. It must then also have a deposit amount and the bond amount that you will be applying it for. Now, that said, not all offers and not all buyers are able to put down a deposit, but if you are able to put in a deposit, it makes applying to the banks a much easier process for you. It makes securing that offer, it makes presenting it to the seller and securing that offer and wanting the seller to accept your offer, puts you as a buyer in a stronger position, having a deposit. And then going back to the banks or the bond issuer, it gives you more likely a chance of the banks loaning you the money versus trying for 100% bond. That said, banks are still issuing 100% bonds, okay, no problem, but it might come with a bit of a higher interest rate. It could come with the fact that you need to be earning X amount. It could come with lots of other small things, versus where a deposit can mitigate a lot of those things that the bank looks at. So you then put in the bond amount that you require, and then there'll be a bunch of conditions on the offer, just stating, you know, agent's commission, things like the breach clause should you decide to pull out of the offer. Like I said, once that's signed, and in the transfer process, should you decide as a buyer or seller to pull out of the offer at any stage for whatever reason that might be, and it's not likely, I don't have a lot of those types of offers, but that there are costs and that there are penalties to be paid when you decide to pull out. Because work has been done, people have gone through bond processes. Say, for example, a seller has gone through, getting removal lists, that kind of thing. So if you potentially, as a buyer, decide that you don't want to proceed with this offer, and you're, well into process, there can be costs involved there. So it's just something to be aware of, and you can't get away from that. But if you're not going to pull out of the offer, then there shouldn't be any problem. Then you have, and this is quite an important one, a clause called the irrevocable offer clause. There's Timmy chasing a squirrel, and what that means is, once you as the buyer sign the offer, even if the seller hasn't signed, once your signature goes on that offer, you are bound by that offer until the irrevocable clause expires. And the irrevocable clause has a date on it, and that's as to when the offer expires, and that locks you in as a buyer to say, number one, you can't put in any other offers whilst this offer is in play until it expires. And generally, 3 days is enough. Some offers have 7 days. Every offer is different. Some people need 7 days to decide, whatever it might be. But you don't want to be locked in as a buyer for too long on the irrevocable clause, so that if the seller should decide yes or no, you are then free, once that irrevocable clause has passed, to then put in other offers. So it's important to note that whilst the irrevocable clause is in play, you can't go and put in any other offers. So then that irrevocable clause then gives the seller some chance to decide on the offer, and then gives them a cut-off date as to when they must come back to you by. And if they don't come back to you and that date has passed, then you are free to put in other offers elsewhere. But until that date expires, you are locked into that offer. You cannot put in an offer anywhere else. Then you have the final page of the offer, which needs to be signed by all people that are purchasing. So if you as a buyer are purchasing with a partner, both names and details on the offer there, both signatures on initials on all of the pages, and then signature on the last page. And as a buyer and seller, the purchaser and seller information sheet is also important. That needs to be completed with as much information as possible, because this information sheet, although it's not a binding sheet as to the offer to purchase itself, it's a sheet reflecting that you are giving the correct information, and the transfer attorneys and the bond issuer and many people work off that information. So the information there needs to be correct: cell phone numbers, email addresses, etc., etc. It just cuts down, if the information on there is incorrect or not completely filled out, it just adds to extra time and extra work that people have to do in order to get hold of you and to find out this kind of information. And you don't want a transfer process being slowed down because of silly mistakes on a purchaser or seller information sheet. So the offer needs to be completed fully. Once signed and accepted by the seller, then you are bound as a purchaser and a seller to fulfill your obligations and conditions in that offer. Something to note on the bond clause: if you're going to be applying for a bond, that usually you get there's no law, there's no rule, but usually it's around 21 days in which to apply for your bond. That's 3 weeks. That's plenty of time to submit documents, get the banks to start working on your finances, and to start coming back with information as to whether they will be issuing you with a bond. Sometimes it's shorter, can be 14 days, and sometimes it can be a little bit longer. Should perhaps you as a buyer be maybe self-employed and you need a little bit more time to get documents together, financials, signed off documents by accountants, etc. Going back to self-employed, yes, banks are certainly issuing bonds for self-employed. They have been issuing 100% bonds for self-employed people, but it is without a doubt more difficult to get a bond for a self-employed person. It's a lot more PT, a lot more documents, and a lot more that you have to submit. And I can sort of say from experience that if you are self-employed, I think just expect to have to put down a 20% deposit on a purchase. It's just going to make the application for the bond a lot easier. You'll get a better interest rate versus, say, applying as a self-employed for a 100% bond. Then another clause in there could be a subject to sale. So you as a buyer have a property that you want to or need to sell in order to purchase this property that you are buying. And that would mean that that would be a subject to sale clause. So the offer that you are placing on your new property is subject to you selling the property that you currently have. Sometimes you can try put in an offer. You might be on the limit of what you think you can afford. Firstly, you should try for a pre-approval. That'll give you a better indication. But if you put in an offer without a subject to sale and you start applying for your bond, the banks could come back to you and say, no, look, the only way you can afford this is if you sell your current property. That then would mean that an addendum needs to be done by the transfer attorneys to say that you need to sell your current property in order to purchase this one, and then the banks will issue you the bond for that. However, if you know that you need to sell or you want to sell the place, then you would put in the details of your current home that you are selling in the subject to sale clause. Anyway, as the agent, we do all of this, but we would need this information. Subject to sale of your current property, and you're given a length of time to try and sell your property. Now, again, no law as to what the length of time should be. However, it can be 45 days, it can be 60 days, it could be 90 days in which you need to get an offer on your property. Now, what is the difference between 45, 60 and 90? So you've got to remember, as a buyer, your seller might not want to wait 90 days for you to get an offer on your property. Again, every offer is different, every situation is different, and if an offer comes with a subject to sale clause, that then puts more complexity into the offer itself. So perhaps let's say an example here, a seller needs to sell and they need to be out within 2 months, okay, because they've purchased something themselves and they're moving on and they need to sell within 2 months. You come along as a buyer, the property's been on the market for, let's say, 4 weeks, okay. That seller has now one month left in which to sell, secure their offer. So that could mean then that you as a buyer coming with a subject to sale clause, you could really only get 30 days in which to sell your property, so that seller or your seller knows that their offer is secure. So each situation is different. Again, if a seller is willing to allow a full 90 days, even 120 days, then that's also a possibility. But each situation is different, each seller's situation is different, each purchaser's situation is different. So that's where the negotiation comes in to work out these complexities on something like a subject to sale. Then, what was I going to say here? It's gone. Yeah, it's totally left my head. Then you can also get a situation where you have sold your property. This would also be under the subject to sale clause. You have got an offer on your property, but your buyers are waiting to get their bond. Now that would mean that the offer that you're putting on a property still needs to come with a subject to sale clause, because your buyers, they're still waiting to get their bond. Maybe their bond fails. Your offer is now dud, and you've put in an offer on a property and you haven't managed to secure the sale on your place. So that would mean that unfortunately you would potentially lose out on the property. Oh, that's what I was going to talk about. Then you also have something, not all offers have this, but something that we certainly do, is the continued marketing clause. So this you need to be aware of, and as a buyer and a seller, that you put in an offer on a property, you need to get a bond. 9 times out of 10, we're going to put in there a continued marketing clause so that the seller can carry on marketing the property and accepting other offers whilst you are applying for your bond. So you're generally given 3 weeks to get a bond, that 21 days I mentioned, or might be that you need to get a bond and sell your property and you're given 60 days to sell your property. The seller can continue to market and accept other offers whilst yours is in play, and whilst you are waiting to hear on your property selling, you getting a bond, etc. And you have to understand that this is fair towards the seller and towards you. You've put in your offer, you've got your first choice. However, should a competing offer come along, that seller can accept it, and it's then up to that competing offer to secure their bond, and we don't have a subject to sell in a competing offer because you just want a competing offer as clean as possible. It's up to the competing offer buyer to secure their bond, and then you would be issued with 72 hours notice to fulfill or waiver your offer. Okay. So those are just a few points to note when putting in an offer. Again, you know, your agent should complete your offer for you, because there are complexities within the offer. The agent should get as much information as possible from you. You need to be open and willing to provide as much information as possible so that your agent can complete the offer as best as possible for you, so that there's no grey areas between you and the seller on this agreement. My process is that I get the information from the buyer, from the seller, I complete the offer, and then I send it off to the buyer to sign, and then I send it off to the seller for signature, or acceptance, or decline. From there, there's a potential of the offer being negotiated, but that's, you know, another level of intricacy that I won't get into right now. So you have to be willing, if you're going to be putting in an offer, you have to be willing to put pen to paper. You have to be willing to wait a few days for that irrevocable clause for the seller to decide on yes or no. You have to be willing to give your as much information as possible to your agent, not thinking that you know, some people are cagey with giving information, but if you're putting in an offer to purchase, it's a formal document, and you need to give certain amounts of information to your agent so that the offer can be completed correctly. Same goes for the seller as well. So yeah, those are just a few things on what to expect on when putting in an offer, when signing, and you know, what your agent should be doing for you as well.